If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I can assure you that this podcast will be very helpful for you in practicing your listening skills. So this podcast is for people who want to practice their listening, but who still can't understand native speakers when they speak at normal speed or when they speak with other native speakers. If you can't yet understand native speech like that, then this podcast is perfect for you. I'm speaking a little more clearly and a little bit more slowly so that you can understand me better. And so this is the format of the podcast. I talk about a couple different topics each time in a clear and a little bit slower way, but still natural speech.
Thank you all for listening. I hope that you're doing great today. Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that I read about in a book recently. I actually listened to this book. It was an audiobook. It's a book called Never Split the Difference. It's a really interesting book. It's about negotiation. And recently, in one of the advanced episodes that I recorded, I talked a little bit about negotiating at garage sales. And it got me thinking about this topic. And I remembered this book that I read about a month ago. And I thought, I want to talk a little bit about negotiation, about some different situations in which we might negotiate in the US, and some tips about how to negotiate. Tips that I learned from this book, Never Split the Difference. I think it'll be good for me to talk about a few of those tips today so that I don't forget them. It's always good to teach something after you learn it. It kind of stays in your mind for longer afterwards. It kind of solidifies it in your mind. In English, when we say that something is solidified, we're saying that it becomes more stable, more concrete. It's not gonna disappear, for example. So I'm gonna talk about that today. I think that'll be interesting. Okay, let's talk about negotiation. So this book that I read, Never Split the Difference, is a book that was written by a man who used to be one of the FBI's top hostage crisis negotiators. So what that means is that whenever there was a situation where some person took another person hostage, that means that a person either kidnapped a person or they were robbing a bank and they didn't allow one of the workers to leave and they kept them there with them while they were robbing the bank or something like that. Those are situations when someone takes another person hostage. That's what that word means. So whenever there was a situation like that, this man who wrote this book might have been called to negotiate with the bad guy who took the hostage to try to get the hostage set free. In English, we can use the phrase set free to mean that you liberate or allow something or someone to be free, right? If you set the hostage free, that means you let them go. So that was his job. And so he was and still is one of the world's greatest negotiators. And so in this book, he talks about how to negotiate, how to always or almost always get what you want. And it's a really interesting read. I would highly recommend it. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the tips that he gives. But first, I want to just talk about situations in which you might negotiate, situations involving money. Because in reality, a lot of our interactions are negotiations. When we talk to our kids, when we talk to our spouse. So obviously there are many situations in which we negotiate, but I wanted to talk about some situations that involve money because in the advanced episode that I recorded recently, where I talk about negotiating at garage sales, I mentioned that there aren't that many situations in which we negotiate in the US involving money. However, I was able to think of a few after that episode, so I want to talk a little bit about those. The first situation is if you are at some street market or there is some informal vendor. So this isn't common in the US. This is not something that we have a lot of. We don't have all these different weekly street markets or nightly street markets like there might be in some other countries. In the US, this is much less common, so we don't come across this situation that often. In English, when we say that you come across a situation, this means that you experience a situation. So we don't come across this situation that much, but there are some times where there might be an informal situation where someone is selling something. And for example, like a garage sale, like I already mentioned, that's a situation where you can actually try to get a lower price for an item that you want to buy. So we can definitely negotiate at garage sales or maybe at some other informal places where we're buying something. Another situation in which we might negotiate, I don't know about in the US, maybe, but I'm thinking that it's possible because I've done this in other places, like in Mexico, and that is taxi rides. I'm not 100% sure if you can negotiate a taxi ride in the US, but you can definitely do this in other countries. And who knows, maybe people do this in the US, but I have like zero experience taking taxis in the US. So I don't want to say something that's not true. Maybe this is impossible, but I'm thinking that it might be possible in certain situations. Maybe before you get in the taxi, you might be able to negotiate the price to get to your destination so that the taxi driver doesn't just use the little tool, the meter that he has to track the amount of miles driven or whatever. Because there's that way of charging you when you ride in a taxi, or maybe they can just skip that whole thing and just charge you a price that you determine beforehand. I don't know. I'm guessing that this happens sometimes. I've negotiated taxi prices in Mexico before, and this can be tricky. I've had a couple bad experiences with this, actually. I remember one time we agreed on a price before I got in the car. And then once I got in the car, then he kind of changed the price on me. He said, "Oh, you heard me that it's 300, right?" When I thought it was 200. And I said, "What? We said 200. And he said, "No, 300. But I was already in the taxi, sitting down, and we were about to go. And I just allowed myself to get scammed like that. In English, when we say that someone scams you, this means that they deceive you to get your money. So another way of saying this is that the taxi driver ripped me off. He was able to get more money out of me than he should have. But I just allowed it to happen, and I said, okay, 300, and then we left. So it can be tricky if you're dealing with someone, a taxi driver who wants to rip you off, or they think you're a tourist. It can be tricky to negotiate with taxi drivers. Another situation in which people might negotiate in the US is buying a car. So I've never done this at a car dealership. This is the place where they sell cars. This is a dealership. I've never done this before. I've never bought a car at a dealership. But for example, you can do it there, or you could do it when you're just buying a used car from a private seller. You might negotiate the price. So I had to negotiate as a seller recently. Last year, we bought a car, which we negotiated a little bit from the private seller. And then the car actually turned out to have many problems. And so we decided to sell it, and we had to negotiate the price with different potential buyers. And that was really stressful because none of these potential buyers wanted to pay anywhere near the amount that I wanted for the car. And they were trying to negotiate the price down very low. And this happened multiple times. And then I realized that this car was not going to sell for a lot. I had to lower the price and give in to this negotiation. In English, when we say that you give in to something or someone, we're saying that you surrender to it. So I kind of had to surrender to this negotiation a little bit, and I sold the car for cheap. Another time when you might negotiate in the US is with your salary. If you are interviewing for a job, of course, you might have the chance to negotiate your salary with the interviewer. And if you want a raise when you already have a job, you might be able to negotiate a raise as well. That's pretty common. And then, of course, you can also negotiate big business deals. Maybe you have a job where you have to sell or buy or come to an agreement with another party, and you have to do this as your job. By the way, we can use the word party to talk about a person or people involved in some business deal or something like that. So the other party refers to the other person or the other people. So you might have to negotiate big business deals. For example, sports agents need to negotiate these big contracts for their clients who are these athletes. So they have to negotiate and try to get the best contract for the soccer player or the basketball player or whoever their client is. So you might not be a sports agent, but maybe you have to negotiate big deals with other companies or businessmen or whoever it may be. So there is a lot of negotiation in different businesses. That's something that many people have to do. All right, now I want to talk about a few tips that the author of this book gives regarding negotiation. So one of his best tips is that people want to feel understood. That's one of our primary desires. We want to feel that the other person understands us. They're listening to us. They're considering our feelings, our opinion. They're actually listening to what we're saying. And he talks about the fact that if you can get the other party to feel understood and feel like you're really listening to them and you empathize with them, it will be much more likely that you'll reach a deal with them. And not only that, but they'll also feel happy about this deal. They'll feel satisfied with the deal that you've made because you made them feel understood. You built that empathy, that connection with them. And once they feel that, it's much easier to actually get them to agree to what you want, really. And they'll feel much better about that. So he talks about being genuinely empathetic and understanding of them, to focus the conversation on them and what they have to say and not just what you have to say. A lot of times in negotiations, we focus on everything that we want, right? And that's not a good strategy. You should allow the other people to do a lot of the talking, and you should listen and allow them to feel understood and to show them that you really care about them and their feelings and their ideas. So that's a really good tip that he gives. Another tip that he gives that is very counterintuitive, meaning that it goes against what we normally think, is that you shouldn't try to get them to say yes too soon and try to get them to just say yes and agree with everything that you're saying. There are a lot of salespeople nowadays that use this tactic. They try to get you to say yes to many things in the conversation so that you will eventually say yes to their final proposition. So they'll start the conversation by saying, do you appreciate drinking clean water? And of course, everybody says yes to that. Everybody likes clean water. But when someone comes up to us on the street and they start with that question, we immediately feel negative. Even though we say yes, we immediately feel like this person is going to try to sell us something that we don't want. And then they're going to ask a lot of other questions that get us to say yes, 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 until eventually they say, well, great, we have this perfect product for you. Since you like all of this, here it is. Do you want to buy it? Right? We already know what's going to happen. So we aren't enthusiastic about saying yes in these situations. And we don't feel good about someone just trying to get us to say yes and force the yes out of us. So he talks about getting people to actually say no towards the beginning of the conversation. Ask them things that allow them to actually say no. Of course, you eventually want them to say yes at the end, but it's better to go for the no earlier on. And when they say no, it makes them feel more comfortable, and it makes them feel like they are in power and they have autonomy, and it allows them to actually start to have a real conversation with you and not just one of these fake exchanges like I just mentioned, right? They'll actually start to think clearly about what you're saying after you've given them the power to say no early on. It's strange, I know. It's counterintuitive, but studies show that when the person is able to say no to things earlier in the negotiation, it allows them to eventually work towards a real, authentic yes at the end. So I know that sounds a little weird, but I think that it's a very interesting insight, a very interesting tip that he gives. So I recommend that you read more about that in his book or somewhere else. And one other tip that he gives is mirroring. This refers to repeating the last words or the most important 2 or 3 words that the person says. So if they say, we've been dealing with a lot of problems, instead of saying, oh, really? What you can say is, a lot of problems? So you repeat their final words or the most important few words, and it allows them to talk more and to feel more of a connection with you. When you mirror them, it actually makes them feel more connected. When you repeat their words, they feel this bond or connection with you. It's pretty interesting. So if you get into the habit of doing this, you'll allow them to talk more about their problems, feel understood, like I mentioned before, feel like you're listening to them, feel like you're connecting with them, all because you repeated their last few words, all because you turned their last couple words into a question. It's really interesting. It doesn't sound like a really big thing that you do, but he talks about how effective it is. It really helps establish this connection. So those are a few tips that he gives. He gives many more tips. I recommend this book. It's really interesting. It will help you see negotiation in a different way. So check that out. I highly recommend it. All right, we're going to stop there for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.